I didn't think. He just moved. Ethan Walker dropped to his knees in the snow, pressed 2 fingers against the woman's throat, and felt the faintest pulse weak as a candle flame in a windstorm. Her lips were blue. Her skin had gone the color of ash. The blizzard was screaming down from the mountains, and she had maybe 20 minutes left, maybe less. He looked around. There was nobody coming. Nobody who was going to ride out and help. Just Ethan the dark, and a dying woman he had never seen before in his life. He made his choice in about half a second. He pulled her into his arms and turned his horse toward home. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, the kind where an ordinary man does an extraordinary thing, and the whole world tries to tear it down, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me, and I read every one. Now settle in because this is going to be a long one, and I promise you it is worth every minute. The fence line ran along the western edge of Ethan Walker's property for about a quarter mile before it hit the creek bed, and on a normal evening, he could walk it in under 10 minutes. But the evening of November 14th, 1878, was not a normal evening. The sky had turned the color of a bruise somewhere around 4 o'clock, and by the time Ethan pulled on his coat and stepped out the cabin door, the first hard gusts were already cutting across the open land like something with a blade attached. He should have stayed inside. He knew that. Every rancher in Garfield County, with any sense, had already battened down their hatches, pulled their livestock into shelter, and positioned themselves next to a warm fire with enough wood stacked inside to last 3 days. His neighbor Hector had ridden past that afternoon and hollered from the road without even stopping his horse. "Big one coming, Walker. Don't be stupid." And then kept right on riding, because Hector was not in the habit of wasting time on men who didn't listen. Ethan didn't think of himself as a man who didn't listen. He thought of himself as a man who understood that if the north section of his fence collapsed under the weight of a bad storm, he'd lose the 2 remaining cattle he owned to the open territory, and then he'd truly have nothing left to ranching on at all. So he went out. He pulled his hat low, turned his collar up, and walked into the wind. The cold hit him. The way cold always hit a man out here, not gradually, not with any kind of mercy, but all at once and everywhere. It found the gaps in his coat. It went up his sleeves and down the back of his neck, and it pressed against his ears until they ached. The snow was already ankle-deep in the low spots, and the wind was lifting it and throwing it sideways so that every 10 steps he had to stop and orient himself by the fence posts, which were the only steady things in a world that had suddenly gone entirely white. He checked the north section first. 2 posts had leaned, but nothing had snapped. He kicked the base of each one back into alignment-packed snow around the footings with his boot and tested the wire. It held. He let out a long breath that the wind took immediately and scattered somewhere toward Wyoming. He was turning back toward the cabin when he saw something move. At first he thought it was a deer. Maybe an elk pushed down from the higher ground by the storm. It was about 100 yards south, close to the property marker stone. He'd set himself 3 years ago, when he first leased the land, and it was moving the way something moved when it was in serious trouble. Not running, not standing, just sort of collapsing forward in stages 1 degree at a time. Ethan stood still for a moment and watched it. Then the shape moved in a way that no deer moved, and his stomach dropped. He ran. He wasn't a young man anymore. 34 years on hard land had put miles on his body that didn't come off, but he covered that 100 yards faster than he'd moved in years, and when he got close enough to see clearly through the blowing snow. What he found stopped him so completely that he stood there for a full 3 seconds, just trying to make sense of what he was looking at. A woman. She was on her knees beside the property marker stone, and she was going down. Her hands were pressed flat against the stone like she was trying to use it to hold herself up, but her arms were shaking and losing the argument. She was dressed for travel. A long coat, dark, expensive looking, even through the snow and the damage. But the coat was soaked through and her hat was gone, and her hair was loose and plastered against her face, and she was shaking with the kind of violence that meant her body was fighting for its life. "Hey!" Ethan dropped to one knee in front of her. "Hey, look at me." She tried to lift her head. She couldn't quite manage it. He took her face in both hands. His gloves were off. He didn't remember taking them off and tilted her chin up so he could see her eyes. They were open barely, and they were the kind of deep dark brown that he had no particular thought about right at that moment, because she was dying, and that was the only thing that mattered. "Stay with me," he said. "You hear me? Stay right with me." Her lips moved. Nothing came out. He got his arms under her and lifted. She wasn't heavy. She should have been. She was tall for a woman. He could see that even now, but the cold had done something to her that made her feel almost hollow, and he got her up and over his shoulder in one motion and turned back toward the cabin and started walking as fast as he could. Walk in a foot of drifting snow, carrying a woman who couldn't walk herself. The wind hit them from the side like a fist, and he staggered, caught himself, kept moving. "I've got you," he said. He wasn't sure if he was saying it for her benefit or his own. "We're almost there. Just hold on." She didn't answer. She wasn't unconscious. He could feel her hands gripping his coat weakly, fingernails catching on the rough wool, but she was close. Closer than he was comfortable thinking about. It took him 11 minutes to get back to the cabin. He knew because he counted his steps and multiplied, and it was the only thing that kept him from thinking about the cold, which was now working on him too, finding places in his body that had been warm 20 minutes ago and making them into strangers. He hit the cabin door with his shoulder, got it open, got them both inside and kicked it shut behind him. The fire had burned down, but there were still coals. He lay her down on the floor near the hearth, the kindest place he had the warmest boards, and turned immediately to the woodpile. He had 4 logs left inside. He'd been planning to bring more in from the shed in the morning. The shed was now unreachable in this weather. 4 logs. He put all 4 on the coals without thinking about it twice. Then he turned back to her. Her hands were the first problem. He pulled off her gloves, expensive leather soaked through they'd done nothing for her by the time she reached him, and took both her hands in his and held them, pressing them between his palms and rubbing. Her fingers were white at the tips. He'd seen frostbite before, and he knew the line between recoverable and not, and she was close to it, but she hadn't crossed it yet, and that was the only good news available. "Come on," he said quietly. "Come back." He worked on her hands for a long time. The fire caught and began to climb, and the room started to push back against the cold degree by degree. He took off her coat, had to work each button, because her arms were rigid and unresponsive, and rolled up his one spare blanket and tucked it around her. He put her boots by the fire, but not too close. Somewhere around the 30-minute mark, she started shaking harder. He knew that was actually a good sign. It meant her body had found enough warmth to start fighting back, and fighting back looked a lot like falling apart. He sat beside her on the floor with his back against the stone of the hearth, and his legs stretched out, and he stayed there because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. She shook for about an hour. Then she stopped. Then she slept. I didn't sleep. He fed the fire with the last of what he had, broke up an old wooden crate. He didn't sleep. He fed the fire with the last of what he had, broke up an old wooden crate he'd been saving for that purpose without really admitting it to himself. And he listened to the storm tear itself apart against the walls of his cabin, and he watched her breathe, and he thought about the fact that he had no idea who she was, or where she had come from, or how she had ended up alone on the Montana plains in the middle of November, without anyone to know she was missing. I thought about those things for a while. Then he put a small pot of broth on the coals, the last of the beef he'd made 3 days ago, been rationing it, and waited for morning. She woke the next afternoon. I was at the table with a piece of harness leather he'd been trying to mend by hand when he heard her move. He looked up. She was pushing herself up onto one elbow and looking around the cabin with the careful, measuring expression of someone who is taking stock before they commit to anything. Her eyes found him. He stayed where he was. He'd learned a long time ago that a person waking up in a strange place didn't need someone moving toward them immediately. "Good afternoon," he said. She blinked. Her voice came out rough, like it had been scraped clean. "Where am I?" "My place. About 2 miles east of the Garfield Creek crossing, if that means anything to you." She processed that. "You found me." "Found you at my south fence line. You were going down." She looked at her hands. Someone had wrapped them in strips of clean cloth. She turned them over and looked at her palms, and then looked back at him. "You could have left me," she said. It wasn't a question. It was just a statement, like she was identifying something she already knew to be true about the world. "Suppose I could have," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the harness leather again. Seemed like the wrong choice. A pause. "My name is Anna," she said. "Ethan Walker. Mr. Walker." She tried to sit up fully and got about halfway before something in her face told him she'd hit a wall. He stood up, brought a folded blanket, and propped it behind her without being asked. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." She looked around this cabin again. He watched her do it. He knew what she was seeing: the bare walls, the single window with the old skin over it where the glass had cracked 2 winters ago. The rough-hewn table he'd built himself, the single chair, the bed in the corner, made up with one remaining blanket, now that the other was around her. She was reading the place the way a smart person reads a room, learning everything it had to say. "You live here alone," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Have you always?" He considered the question. "No. Had a family spread about 6 miles north growing up. Lost it a few years back." "I'm sorry." "It was debts," he said simply. "Bad ones and bad years together. That's the way it goes sometimes." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been gone since yesterday morning," she said. The people I was traveling with will be looking for me. Storm won't break until morning at earliest," he said. "Nothing moves out there right now. You're safe here, and when it clears, I'll ride out and find someone." Something crossed her face, a complicated flicker that he didn't have a name for. "That's very kind of you." "Just practical." "Most people," she said slowly, "would call letting a stranger freeze to death in a blizzard practical, and call bringing them home their problem." He thought about that. "Most people might be right," he said, "but I don't much care for being most people." She looked at him for a long time after that. He let her look. Then she closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the blanket, and within a few minutes, the steady rhythm of her breathing told him she'd gone back to sleep. He sat back down at the table. He picked up the harness leather. He worked in silence while the storm screamed outside. The next 2 days unfolded. The way forced confinement always unfolds: slowly, then less slowly, then in ways that surprised everyone involved. The storm didn't break on the second morning the way he'd predicted. It shifted instead, pulling east and then circling back, dropping another 6 inches before it finally exhausted itself on the afternoon of the third day. By then, Ethan had run entirely out of firewood. He'd seen it coming on the morning of the second day, and he'd said nothing to her about it because there was nothing to say. He put on every piece of clothing he owned, went out to the shed in the diminished storm, and brought in what he could carry in 2 trips. She'd offered to help on the second trip, and he'd refused, not rudely, but with the firm quiet of a man who has made a decision and doesn't intend to revisit it. By the end of the second day, they had enough. She learned to be useful. That surprised him. He'd made certain assumptions based on her coat and her gloves and the cut of her dress, and those assumptions had included that she would be the kind of woman who watched from a distance while work got done. He was wrong. She found things to do, mended one of his shirts while he worked outside, not perfectly, but with the serious concentration of someone learning, rather than the careless performance of someone pretending. She kept the fire. She helped him drag the water barrel closer to the hearth so it wouldn't freeze in the night. She didn't complain once. On the evening of the second day, he made corn porridge from the last of his cornmeal and divided it into 2 portions and put the larger one in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at his bowl. "You gave me more," she said. "Didn't notice." "Mr. Walker." "Eat, ma'am." She picked up her spoon. Then she put it down again. "You're not going to tell me it's fine, and that you're not hungry when you are," she said. "I'd rather you just tell me the truth." He looked at her across the table. "Truth is, I've eaten less on worse days and gotten by fine." "That," she said, "is almost a truth." He almost smiled. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, and he hadn't had much recent occasion to try, but something about the sharpness of her cut through whatever he'd had built across his face and got close to something underneath it. "Eat," he said again. She ate. Later, when he thought she was asleep, he heard her voice from the corner where the bed was. Can I ask you something personal? He was banking the fire for the night. He didn't turn around. Depends on the question. The ranch you lost, she said. Could you have held it if things had gone differently? He was quiet for a moment. The question was a fair one, and she'd asked it straight, which he respected. Maybe, he said. I made some decisions I wouldn't make again. Held on too long when I should have sold. Trusted the wrong people with money I didn't have enough of to trust wrong people with. Do you regret it? The land. He thought about it. What I regret is that my father built that place. He put 20 years into it. When I lost it, I lost something that wasn't entirely mine to lose. He paused. That's the part that stays with me. Silence. I'm sorry, she said. Not with the reflexive politeness she'd used before. Something different in it this time. Something that sounded like she meant it in a way that was specific rather than general. Don't be, he said. It made me what I am, and I can live with what I am. In the morning on the third day, the storm finally stopped. He rode out at first light and made it into town by mid-morning. He went to the telegraph office first, because that was the fastest way to reach anyone. And he told the operator, a thin, reedy man named Cassidy, who had been known to repeat information freely, simply that a woman had been caught in the blizzard and had taken shelter at his place and was safe, and he needed to know if anyone was looking for her. He hadn't given a name. He'd given only a description. Dark hair, tall dark coat, traveling clothes. He was at the dry goods store buying what he needed. Cornmeal salt pork, 2 pounds of coffee, because he was almost out, and a man could face most things if he had coffee when he heard it. He heard it the way you heard things in small towns, not directly, not from the source, but carried around a corner by someone who didn't know you were there. The Whitmore girl. He stopped. Been missing since Wednesday. They had a search party out, but the storm... The old man must be losing his mind. She's all he's got left since the boy. Whitmore. Ethan stood in the dry goods store with a sack of cornmeal in one hand, and he turned the name over in his mind, the way you turned a stone over to see what was living under it. He knew the name Whitmore. Every man, woman, and child in the Montana Territory knew the name Whitmore. Cornelius Whitmore had come to Montana in the 1850s with nothing but a horse and a willingness to do work that broke other men, and by 1878 he owned more cattle, more land, and more political goodwill than any other single person in the territory. He had holdings in 3 counties. He had men working for him who had their own men working for them. He had a house in Billings that people referred to as the mansion, not ironically. Ethan had seen Cornelius Whitmore exactly once in his life at a cattle auction 4 years ago across a wide yard full of noise and animals. He had not introduced himself. Men like Ethan Walker didn't introduce themselves to men like Cornelius Whitmore. There was no mechanism for it. They existed on different planes. And now, he stood in the dry goods store and he thought about the woman sitting in his cabin. Anna, she'd said. Just Anna, watching him with those careful eyes while he fed her his last corn porridge and told her things he hadn't told anyone in years. He thought about the way she'd looked at his cabin, the way she'd looked at his bowl, the way she'd said, "That's almost a truth," with the precision of someone who knew exactly what a full truth sounded like and had learned to distinguish it from approximations. He paid for his supplies. He rode back. She was at the window when he came in, standing fully dressed in her own repaired clothes, watching the road. She turned when she heard the door. She saw his face. Whatever was on it, it was enough. He watched her shoulders come down a fraction of an inch, and in that fraction of an inch, he saw something that he recognized as resignation, the particular kind that comes from a secret that has stopped being a secret. "You heard," she said. "I heard a name," he said. He put his supplies on the table. He didn't move toward her. "Whether it's the right one, I suppose that's your business to decide." She looked at him for a long moment. "My name is Anna Whitmore." He nodded. "My father is—" "I know who your father is." Silence. The fire popped. Outside, the snow was brilliant white and still. "Does it change anything?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was watching him the way she'd been watching him since she woke up, carefully, completely, like she was recording everything and would review it later. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. Change what, he said. What you think of me. Why you helped me. Whether... She stopped, started again. People always change when they know. I just need to know if you will. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down and started unpacking the supplies. I pulled you out of the snow because you were a person who was dying, he said. That's the whole of it. Your daddy's name didn't factor into the calculation because I didn't know it, and if I had known it, it still wouldn't have factored in because that's not a factor I use. He set the salt pork on the table. You're a person. You were dying. Now you're not. That's the story. She stood very still. Why? She said. Not asking why he'd saved her, they'd covered that. Asking something different, something underneath it. Why what? Why are you like this? She said it with a genuine confusion that he recognized as the confusion of someone who had been given something they weren't expecting and couldn't locate a category for it. Men like you men who have so little they should want something. Everyone wants something. My father says there is no kindness that doesn't have a price attached. Ethan set down what he was holding and looked at her straight. Your father sounds like a man who's been around too many men trying to take things from him, he said. That'd give anyone a crooked view of the world. He picked up what he'd set down. Not everyone's trying to take something, Miss Whitmore. Some people are just trying to get through the day without becoming someone they'd be ashamed of. She sat down in the chair across from him. She was quiet for a long time. I grew up, she said finally, with people who wanted my family's name or my family's money. The ones who wanted my father's approval. The ones who wanted my hand because my hand came with 10,000 head of cattle. She looked down at her own hands, the ones he'd wrapped and warmed 3 days ago. I have never once in my life sat across a table from a man who fed me his last corn porridge and then didn't want anything back. Well, he said, now you have. She looked up at him, and for just a moment, just one something happened in her face that he looked away from quickly because it was the kind of thing a man shouldn't watch if it wasn't meant for him, and he wasn't sure yet what was meant for him and what wasn't. I should get home, she said. Yes, he said. I'll ride out with you first light tomorrow. Make sure you get there safe. You don't have to. No, he said. I reckon I don't, but I will. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once with the decisive certainty of someone who has decided to stop arguing about something they've already lost. All right, she said. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Ethan. A pause. Thank you, Ethan. He cooked supper. Salt pork and coffee, and the last of some dried beans he'd had in the back of the cupboard. She ate without commenting on the size of her portion versus his, though he saw her notice. She was learning him. He was aware of it, the way you were aware of weather, not directly, but in the pressure of it, in the way it changed what a room felt like. After supper, she asked him about the land again. Not about what he'd lost, but about what he had now. He told her about the lease. 40 acres of reasonable grass, and a creek that didn't dry up until August, which was better than some people had. He told her about the 2 cattle, the horse, the garden he kept behind the shed, that got him through October if the frost came late. He told her about the fencing work he did for neighboring ranches when his own land didn't need him, which was where most of his actual cash came from. He told her these things plainly, without apology, and without the false brightening that some men used when they were embarrassed about what they had. He had learned that the world could tell the difference between a man who was ashamed of his circumstances and a man who simply had circumstances, and he preferred to be the second kind. She listened to all of it. Do you like it? She said. This life. Parts of it, he said honestly. The being your own boss part. The being outside part. The part where what you build is yours and what you lose is yours too, and nobody else is responsible for either one. And the parts you don't like. He thought about it. The quiet, he said finally. Some days the quiet gets long. She nodded slowly. I know something about that, she said, and she said it in a voice that told him she did, and that the quiet she knew was a different kind of quiet than his. Not the quiet of an empty cabin in open country, but the quiet of a house full of people where nobody says the true thing, and that was maybe the lonelier kind. He didn't push it. They let the fire burn down, and the evening come on, and when the last of the light was gone, and the stars were out over the Montana, dark, brilliant, and cold, and impossibly numerous, the way they were, only after a storm had cleaned everything, she stood at the window for a long time, looking at them without saying anything. He let her look. She turned eventually and said good night, and he gave her the bed again, and made himself comfortable in the chair by the hearth, and he lay in the dark for a long time, listening to her breathe and thinking about the fact that in the morning she would go back to the world she came from, and he would go back to the world he had, and those two worlds did not in the ordinary course of things have any intersection whatsoever. He thought about her voice when she'd said the quiet gets long. He thought about her face in that one unguarded moment he'd looked away from. He told himself to stop thinking about those things, because there was no useful direction that kind of thinking went, and he was a man who tried not to spend energy in useless directions. He closed his eyes. In the morning he saddled the horse, and they rode out together into a world washed clean and blazing white. And 3 hours later, the Whitmore estate rose up on the horizon, like something from a different country, which it was, and Ethan felt the distance between them in a way that was physical, as much as anything else. A kind of pressure in his chest that he didn't name, because naming it wouldn't help. She stopped her horse at the gate. He stopped beside her. She turned to look at him. "You'll come in," she said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a command. "I don't think that's necessary," he said. "I'd like you to." He looked at the gate, at the long drive beyond it, at the shape of the house at the end of it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Anna," she said. The same way he'd said his own name to her 3 days ago, correcting the formality, replacing it with something closer to what was actually true. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll see you to the door," he said. "Then I'll head back." She held his gaze for a long beat. Then she nodded and turned her horse toward the gate, and he followed her. And as they rode up that long drive together, he kept his eyes forward and his face still, and he didn't let himself think a single thing about any of it. Because a man had to know what he had, and what he had at the end of this was a story about a woman he'd pulled from the snow. A good one. The kind you were glad to have in you. That was enough. He told himself that. He almost believed it. The gate closed behind them with a sound that Ethan felt more than heard, a deep iron finality, like a period at the end of a sentence he hadn't finished reading yet. He rode up the drive with Anna beside him, and kept his eyes forward and his face neutral, which was something he was good at. He'd had years of practice keeping his face neutral in situations that were trying hard to make it otherwise. But this one tested him. Because the closer they got to the house, the more the distance between who she was and who he was made itself known. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small details that a man couldn't ignore if he was paying attention. The width of the drive, the size of the barn, the hands moving around the yard who stopped working when they saw who was coming and started moving faster purposefully, the way people moved when someone important had returned. A woman came out of the house first. Older, thick through the middle, with the expression of someone who had been managing worry for 3 days and was now managing relief with the same intensity. She was down the porch steps before Anna had fully dismounted, and she had Anna's face in her hands before Anna had both feet on the ground. "Lord above," the woman said. "Lord above, child." "I'm all right, May," Anna said. "I promise I'm all right. You've been gone 3 days. 3 days, Anna." "I know. I'm sorry." The woman May pulled back enough to look at her face. Then she looked at Ethan, still on his horse hat in hand, waiting. She looked at him the way women who had managed large households looked at unknown men thoroughly, without apology, filing everything she saw. "This the man," she said to Anna. "This is Ethan Walker," Anna said. "He found me at his fence line, brought me in out of the storm." May looked at Ethan for another long moment. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded once, with the specific decisiveness of a woman who has formed a complete opinion in under 10 seconds and is confident in its accuracy. "Mr. Walker," she said, "you'd best come inside." "I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I've got a ride back." "Inside." May said in a tone that made it clear the conversation about whether he was going inside had already concluded. He got off his horse. I was barely through the front door, barely past the entry hall with its broad floors and high ceiling, and the kind of furniture that took craftsmen months to make, when he heard the steps on the staircase. Heavy fast, the steps of a man who moved like someone who expected the world to get out of his way. Cornelius Whitmore came around the landing with the bearing of a man who had built himself from nothing and hadn't forgotten a single day of the building. He was in his 60s, wide through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something that was simultaneously imposing and entirely readable. He looked at Anna, and his face did something complicated in private that he shut down almost immediately. Then he looked at Ethan. "You're Walker," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." Whitmore looked at him the way he probably looked at cattle. He was thinking about buying, assessing, careful, not hostile, but not warm either. "You found my daughter." "I found a woman in the snow at my fence line," Ethan said. "Brought her in. Didn't know who she was until the second day." "And when you knew, didn't change anything that needed doing." Whitmore held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Ethan held it back. He wasn't going to look away first, not because of pride exactly, but because looking away would be a lie, and he wasn't in the habit of lying with his body any more than with his words. "Sit down," Whitmore said finally. They sat in a room that had more books in it than Ethan had seen in any building outside of a library, and a fire in a hearth big enough to stand in, and Whitmore poured whiskey from a bottle that probably cost more than Ethan made in a month and pushed a glass across the table toward him. Ethan took it. He didn't drink immediately. He waited. "What do you want?" Whitmore said. Ethan set the glass down. "Pardon. For bringing her back. For what you spent wood food your time. What do you want?" There it was. Ethan had known it was coming, and he'd decided in advance how to handle it, which was the only reason he didn't let anything show in his face when it arrived. "Nothing," he said. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Nobody does something for nothing." "With respect, sir, that sounds like a man talking who spent too long around people who want things from him." Silence. Anna, standing in the doorway, made a small sound that might have been a breath, or might have been something else entirely. Whitmore looked at his daughter, then back at Ethan. Then he picked up his own glass and drank from it and set it down and said, "I'd like to compensate you for your trouble." "I'd rather you didn't," Ethan said. "That's a proud answer for a man with 40 acres and 2 cattle. Ethan didn't flinch. "Yes, sir, it is." Another silence. Longer this time. The fire moved in the big hearth, and somewhere in the house a door opened and closed, and outside, through the tall windows, the winter light was doing what winter light did in Montana, cutting hard and sideways across the snow, making everything stark and specific. Whitmore put his glass down. "All right," he said finally, and in those 2 words, Ethan heard something shift. Not warmth, not yet, but something that was no longer purely opposition. A recalibration. The sound of a man who had dealt with enough people in his life to recognize something genuine when it sat across from him and refused to move. Ethan left an hour later. He shook Whitmore's hand, nodded to May, and went out to where his horse had been fed and watered by someone he hadn't seen do it, which told him things about how this household ran. He was putting his boot in the stirrup when he heard the door behind him. "Ethan." He turned. Anna was on the porch, her arms crossed against the cold. No coat, the way people came outside when they meant to say something quick. "I didn't say thank you properly," she said. "You said it fine." "No." She came down 2 steps. "I said the words. That's not the same as saying it properly." She stopped on the second step, which put her eyes level with his, since he was on the ground, and she was elevated, and she looked at him with the same directness she'd been looking at him with for 3 days. "You gave me everything you had. Your wood, your food, your bed. And you never once made me feel like a burden. You weren't a burden. Ethan." She said his name with a firmness that asked him to stop deflecting and just receive what she was giving him. "Let me say this." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. Not just the practical parts. For talking to me like I was a person. For not changing when you found out. A pause. Most people change. Most people are making decisions about what they want, he said. I wasn't making that kind of decision. She held his gaze. I know, she said. That's the part that stayed with me. He got on his horse. He was aware of doing it. Aware of the precise moment when he had to stop looking at her in order to look at where he was going. And he made that transition with the deliberate control of a man who understood that some moments were not his to keep. Take care of yourself, Miss Whitmore, he said. Anna, she said. Still correcting him. Still. Anna, he said. He rode out. He didn't look back. He had a rule about that, not a formal one, not something he'd ever articulated, but a rule his body knew, and he kept it all the way down the drive and through the gate and out onto the open road. And then the Whitmore estate was behind him, and the miles of white open country were ahead of him, and he had 40 acres and 2 cattle and a cabin to get back to. He focused on that. He made himself focus on that. The town's reaction arrived faster than he expected. He'd been back 2 days when Hector came by the fence line where Ethan was working and leaned on the top rail and said without any preliminary, "You know the whole county's talking about you." I figured, Ethan said. He drove a staple without looking up. Saying you rescued the Whitmore girl. I brought a woman in from a storm, Ethan said. That's the whole story. That's not the whole story they're telling. Hector shifted his weight on the rail. He was a compact man, weathered with the slow, careful speech of someone who thought before he talked. Ethan had known him 7 years and trusted him as much as he trusted anyone. Some people are calling you a hero. Others are saying you're after her money. Ethan drove the next staple. Let them say what they want, he said. And some people, Hector continued as if Ethan hadn't spoken, are saying that a man like you oughtn't get ideas above his station. That you did a decent thing and you should leave it there. Ethan stopped. He straightened and looked at Hector. Who's saying that? Hector looked out at the horizon, the way he did when he was about to say something he knew wouldn't be well received. Bennett, he said. Charles Bennett. He was at the dry goods store yesterday afternoon being very loud about it in front of several people. Ethan had heard the name. Most people in the county had. Charles Bennett was the kind of man who existed at a particular intersection, wealthy enough to have opinions that people listened to, not quite wealthy enough to be immune to the discomfort of anyone challenging that wealth. He ran cattle, owned some land, and had been by the general account of everyone Ethan had ever spoken to about it, expecting to marry Anna Whitmore for approximately 3 years. Ethan picked up his hammer again. Well, he said, he can be loud about it all he wants. He said, Hector continued with the tone of a man completing an unpleasant duty, that poor men who get ideas about rich women are doing themselves no favors and ought to know their place. Ethan drove the staple, harder than the previous ones. He said that, Ethan said, in front of witnesses. Ethan moved to the next post. He worked in silence for a moment, with the specific focused quality of a man putting his energy somewhere useful before he did something less useful with it. He say anything about her? Ethan asked. Said she was grateful like any decent woman would be. Said gratitude wasn't anything else. Ethan nodded slowly. He thought about Anna on the second step of her porch with no coat on in the cold, asking him to let her say something properly, and then saying it with her eyes as much as her words. He thought about what Charles Bennett knew about that moment, which was nothing, and what he thought he knew, which was apparently quite a lot. All right, he said. That's all you're going to say. What would you like me to say, Hector? His neighbor scratched the back of his neck. I'd like you to say you're not going to do anything that makes your situation worse than it already is. I'm not going to do anything, Ethan said. Bennett can talk. Talking's free. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the fence rail and said, Just watch yourself, and walked back to his own horse, and Ethan watched him go, and then went back to his fence line and worked until dark. He had been back 5 days when the rider came. Howe was at the stove mid-morning when he heard hooves in the yard. He went to the door and opened it and found a young man, a boy really 17 or 18, on a tall bay horse wearing Whitmore livery, holding out an envelope. "From Miss Whitmore, sir," the boy said. Ethan took the envelope, turned it over. His name was on it in a clean, angular hand. "She said there's no reply needed unless you want to send one," the boy said. "Wait a moment," Ethan said. He opened the envelope. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph thanked him again for his hospitality and expressed the hope that he had returned home without difficulty. The second paragraph said, "I find that I haven't been able to stop thinking about something you said. You told me that some people are just trying to get through the day without becoming someone they'd be ashamed of. I've been considering whether I have been doing that. I'm not certain the answer is yes. I'd welcome your thoughts on it if you're willing to share them." That was all. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and went back inside and stood at the stove for a while, thinking about 2 paragraphs that said a great deal more than 2 paragraphs usually manage to say. He wrote back that evening. He was not a fast writer. He'd had schooling enough to be competent, not enough to be elegant, and he wrote 3 drafts before he had something he was willing to send, which was this: "Miss Whitmore, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer a question like that since I haven't met enough people to know what the standard ought to be. What I know from my own experience is that the moments I'm least proud of were the ones where I let somebody else decide what I was worth. I think the question you're asking yourself is a better sign than most people get. Most people don't ask it at all. E. Walker." He sent it back with the boy the next morning and went to work and told himself that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. She wrote back 4 days later. He wrote back the day after that. The letters were careful at first, proper, the way correspondence between people who didn't know each other well was supposed to be, and then they became less careful. The way correspondence between people who were paying close attention to each other always eventually did. She asked him what he thought about fairness. He told her he thought fairness was something people talked about more than they practiced, including himself. She asked him whether he had ever wanted a different life. He thought about that one for 2 days before he answered, which was yes and no. "And mostly I've learned that wanting a different life is a waste of the one you have, but I won't lie and say I haven't stood at a fence line and looked at what I lost and wanted it back." She asked him whether he was lonely. He didn't answer that one directly. He wrote instead, "I think everyone is lonely at some point, and some people get better at it than others, and I've gotten fairly good at it, which is either a skill or a problem, depending on how you look at it." She wrote back, "I think it might be both." He almost smiled when he read that. He was almost smiling more often. He noticed this. He was not sure what to do with it. 3 weeks after he'd brought her home from the storm, he went into town for supplies and encountered Charles Bennett for the first time since Hector's warning. It happened at the horse post outside the dry goods store. Bennett was coming out as Ethan was going in, and they came face to face with the unavoidable proximity of men who have been talking about each other and are now suddenly in the same physical space. Bennett was a large man, well dressed for the territory, which meant his coat was expensive and his boots were clean, with the particular confidence of someone who had never had a reason to question his own standing. He looked at Ethan with an expression that Ethan recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man performing dismissal for an audience, which in this case was the 2 men standing behind Bennett who'd come out of the store with him and were now watching. "Walker," Bennett said. "Bennett. Heard you've been corresponding with the Whitmore girl." Ethan kept his face neutral. "I don't see how that's your business." "Protecting community standards," Bennett said easily, with the tone of a man who expected that phrase to carry weight, "is everyone's business." He took a small step that put him directly in Ethan's path. Not aggressive exactly, just occupying space in a way that required Ethan to either stop or go around. "You did a decent thing bringing her in from the storm. Nobody's going to take that away from you. But decent things have their natural place, and getting ideas above that place doesn't do anyone any good, especially not her." "That's a long way around," Ethan said, "to telling me to stay away from her." "I'm not telling you anything," Bennett said pleasantly. "I'm just observing that a woman like Anna Whitmore has a future that requires a certain kind of man. And you," he looked at Ethan with a slow, specific assessment, "are not that kind of man. No insult intended." "None taken," Ethan said with a flatness that made it clear he'd registered every syllable of what Bennett had said, and had decided deliberately not to start anything about it here. He stepped around Bennett and went into the store. He bought his supplies. He took his time doing it. When he came out, Bennett was gone. The two men who'd been watching were still at the post, and one of them, a younger man, somebody's hired hand, by the look of his clothes, met Ethan's eyes and then looked away. Not out of hostility. Out of the private embarrassment of a person who'd just watched something they hadn't enjoyed watching. Ethan rode home. He thought about what Bennett had said. Not the insult was obvious and uncomplicated, but the confidence behind it. The ease with which a man like Bennett stood in the middle of a public space and arranged the world according to what he believed he deserved without a moment's uncertainty. Ethan had known men like that his whole life. He'd watched them from the other side of fences and auction yards and restaurant windows, and he'd never quite figured out whether the confidence came first or the money did. He got back to the cabin and unsaddled the horse, and he was hanging up the tack when he heard hooves in the yard again. He went to the door. It was Anna. She was alone. No escort. No livery rider. Just Anna on a dark horse with her good coat on and her chin set and her eyes bright with something that might have been cold or might have been something else. He stood in the doorway. She pulled up and looked at him. "I heard about Bennett," she said. "Word travels," he said. "I want you to know that whatever he said, Anna." He said her name with a quiet that stopped her. "It doesn't matter." "It does matter." She got off the horse with a quick, decisive motion. "He said those things in public, about both of us. It matters. What he thinks about where I belong doesn't move me much." "It should move you enough to be angry," she said. She was standing in his yard now 10 feet away, and she looked not furious exactly, but at the edge of something, like a woman who had been managing too many careful feelings in too careful a way, and one of them had found a seam. "I am angry," he said. "I'm keeping it somewhere useful." She looked at him. The bright thing in her eyes settled into something more complicated. "I owe you an apology," she said. He blinked. "What for?" "For putting you in this position. For the letters." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but the way a person did when they were holding themselves together. "I started writing to you because I wanted to. I didn't think sufficiently about what it would cost you. You don't owe me an apology for writing letters. Bennett is telling everyone that you're—" "I know what Bennett is telling everyone." He stepped off the porch and closed the distance between them by half. Not all the way, just half. "Anna, what other people are saying about my motivations has no bearing on what my motivations actually are. I know what they are. You know what they are. That's the only arithmetic that counts." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was working on her face, pink at the cheeks at the tips of her ears, and she hadn't pulled up her collar, and she wasn't going to. He could tell, because she was too focused on the thing she'd come here to say to attend to the cold. "My father," she said carefully, "has been approached by Charles Bennett formally. About a proposal." Ethan was very still. "He hasn't given an answer," she said. "But he's considering it. He thinks—" She stopped, recalibrated, started again. "He's told me that a match with Charles would be sensible. That Charles is a known quantity. That Charles understands the kind of life I was raised in." "And what did you tell him?" She looked at him steadily. "I told him I needed time to think." "And are you thinking?" "I'm standing in your yard," she said. "In the cold, without being invited. So yes, Ethan, I'm thinking." I had not moved. She had not moved. The space between them was exactly what it had been when he'd stepped off the porch, not close enough for anything other than a conversation, but not far enough that either of them could pretend this was merely a conversation. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She took a breath. "About the difference between a life that makes sense on paper and a life that makes you feel like a person." She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands he'd wrapped in cloth strips 3 weeks ago, and then looked back up at him. "My father loves me. I believe that. But he also believes that love is expressed through security, and security looks like Charles Bennett." "And what does security look like to you?" Ethan asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I knew," she said. "I grew up knowing. Security was the house and the cattle and the name. It was things that lasted. And now, she looked at him with an openness that cost her something. He could see the specific weight of it in her face. Now I think I've been confusing security with something else entirely. A pause. I think I've been calling a cage a house for so long I didn't notice the bars. Something tightened in his chest with a grip he wasn't prepared for. Anna, he said carefully. I'm a man with 40 acres and a lease I don't own and 2 cattle and a horse. I can't give you what your father can give you. I know that. I want you to know I know that too, he said. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that what I can offer is equivalent. It isn't. I'm not asking you to tell me that. Then what are you asking me? She looked at him steadily, with the full force of someone who has been thinking about a question for 3 weeks and has finally arrived at the place where they are going to say it out loud. I'm asking, she said, whether you think a person can be happy in a life that has less than they were raised with, if the life has other things in it instead. He thought about that. He took it seriously, the way he took everything she said seriously, which was something she'd noticed, and he was aware she'd noticed. I think, he said slowly, that a person can be miserable in a big house and content in a small one. I think what's in the life matters more than the size of it. But I also think... He stopped, and when he started again, his voice was lower and more careful. That a person who grew up with certain things doesn't always know in advance which ones they can do without. And finding out the hard way is harder than it sounds when you're standing outside in the cold deciding. She absorbed that. You're warning me, she said. I'm being honest with you, he said, the way I always try to be. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved her hair. She didn't reach up to fix it. Ethan, she said, if I told you I wanted to try... Don't say it today, he said. His voice was quiet, but it was firm. Don't say it out here when you're angry at Bennett and your father and everything that's been pressing on you. That's not the right reason to say it. She blinked. Something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or the more complicated feeling of having a person anticipate what's best for you and say it before you've said it yourself. When is the right time, she said. When you've sat with it long enough that you're sure it's yours, he said. Not anyone else's, not a reaction to something, yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted. Something she had been holding tight released slightly, the way the surface of a river released when the ice started to go in early spring. You, she said, are a very aggravating man. I've been told, he said. You could just... She stopped. I know, he said. But I won't. She held his gaze. Then she turned and got back on her horse with the same quick, decisive motion she'd used to get off it, and she looked down at him from that elevation for a moment. I'll write to you, she said. I'll write back, he said. She rode out. He stood in the yard and watched her go, and he felt with the particular clarity that sometimes came to him in moments of significant restraint that he had just done. Either the wisest thing he'd done in a long time, or the most foolish, and he was not entirely certain which. I went back inside. He put the kettle on. He sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the surface, and he looked at them. Rough hands scarred along the knuckles, the hands of a man who worked, and he thought about what she'd said about bars and cages and calling one thing by another name. He thought about his father's land, about the morning he'd stood at the fence of the property that was no longer his and watched the new owner's cattle moving across the grass and decided in that moment that he was going to live the rest of his life by exactly one rule. He would know what he was, and he would be it completely, and he would not apologize for it, and he would not pretend otherwise. He thought about Anna Whitmore, who had looked at everything he had and hadn't looked away. I thought about Charles Bennett, standing in front of the dry goods store, with 2 witnesses arranged behind him like props. He thought about what it meant to be a known quantity. The kettle started to sing. He got up and made the coffee and stood at the small window of his small cabin on his leased 40 acres and looked out at the winter country, clean and white and enormous, and he thought that Montana was a place where a man could see a long way in every direction, which was sometimes a comfort and sometimes the hardest thing in the world. He drank his coffee. He waited, And 6 days later, on a Tuesday morning, when the temperature had climbed enough to suggest that somewhere under all that white, the world was still turning toward spring, a letter arrived that was not careful, and was not proper, and was not 2 paragraphs. It was 7 pages. And on the last page, in that clean, angular hand, he had come to recognize immediately she had written, "I've sat with it long enough. I'm sure it's mine. Now tell me honestly, what do you want?" He sat at the table with that letter for a long time. Then he got out his pen. He wrote back the same day he received her 7-page letter. He didn't write 7 pages. He wrote 1 paragraph because 1 paragraph was all he needed, and he had learned by now that Anna Whitmore could read between lines better than most people could read what was written on them. He wrote, "I want what I've always wanted, a life I can stand inside without shrinking. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago that there was a version of that life that had another person in it. Now I find I can't unknow it. That's as honest as I can be. The rest is yours to decide. E." He sent it with Hector's son, who was going past the Whitmore Road anyway, and then he went out to his south pasture and worked on the water trough that had been giving him trouble since October, and he did not think about what he'd written or told himself he didn't, which was not the same thing. Her reply came the next morning. 3 words. "Then let's begin." He read those 3 words standing in his doorway in the early cold with his coffee in his hand, and something moved through him that he hadn't felt in so long. He'd stopped checking for it, a kind of loosening like a knot worked out of a rope after years of tension. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket next to the first letter she'd ever sent him, and he went inside and finished his breakfast. What happened next was not romantic in the way that stories made things romantic. It was quieter than that, and more real, and in some ways, more difficult. Anna began visiting the ranch. Not secretly, she told her father where she was going, which was a conversation Ethan would not learn the details of until much later, and which had apparently lasted most of an evening and ended without resolution on either side. She rode out twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and she learned the 40 acres with the same focused attention she'd brought to everything else. She learned which fence posts were solid and which ones were liars. She learned the moods of his 2 remaining cattle, a brown cow he called Margaret for no particular reason, and a younger heifer that didn't have a name yet, because naming something you might have to sell in the spring was a kind of cruelty he'd always avoided. She learned that the well went soft in July, and that the north field was better for hay than the south one, and that Ethan Walker's idea of breakfast was coffee and whatever was left from the night before, and she said nothing about this, except on the 3rd visit, showing up with a pan of biscuits in a cloth and setting them on his table without comment. He looked at the biscuits. Then he looked at her. "May taught me," she said with the careful neutrality of someone not asking for a reaction. "They look good," he said. "Sit down and find out," she said. He sat down. They were in fact very good biscuits. He ate 3 of them and told her so in plain language, and she didn't smile exactly, but her face did something that was adjacent to a smile, and that he was learning to recognize as the version she used when she was pleased about something, but didn't want to make too much of it. Those mornings at the table over biscuits or coffee, or the particular nothing of 2 people simply sitting in the same space comfortably, were the part he would remember longest. The conversation that happened over a work table while someone's hands were busy was a different conversation than the kind that happened face-to-face by design. And those were the conversations where he learned who she actually was under the careful presentation she'd developed over a lifetime of being Cornelius Whitmore's daughter. She was sharper than she let on in company. She had opinions about cattle breeding that were more informed than his own, which he told her with the directness he used for everything, and which made her laugh, a real laugh. Not the social one he'd heard her use at the periphery of other exchanges, but the one that caught her by surprise. She was impatient with waste of any kind of resources of time, and especially of honesty, which she treated as the most limited and valuable commodity available. She had a temper that she managed with a discipline that he recognized because he managed his own the same way, and knowing that about each other created between them a kind of mutual understanding that was different from affection but ran just as deep. How was learning her? She was learning him. Neither of them talked much about what they were building because talking about it would have required naming it, and naming it would have made it something that other people could have opinions about before they'd had a chance to make it solid. Other people, as it turned out, were not waiting for an invitation to have opinions. It was a Saturday in early February when Ethan went into town for the monthly settlement of his supply account and walked directly into the middle of something he had not anticipated. The dry goods store was more crowded than usual. End of the month brought people in from the outlying ranches, and the noise hit him as soon as he pushed through the door. He took his place in line and was waiting his turn when he became aware gradually, and then all at once, that a cluster of men near the back of the store had gone quiet in a way that was specific to his arrival. He kept his face forward. He'd learned that particular quiet before. He conducted his business. He paid what he owed, which was not inconsiderable. Supplies through a Montana winter were what they were, and he was moving toward the door when the voice reached him. There he is. Not loud. Carried to him, deliberately pitched for exactly the distance between them. The rancher who thinks he found himself a shortcut. Ethan stopped. He turned around, which was a choice, and he looked at the cluster of men, which was another choice, and he found what he expected to find. Charles Bennett, with his good coat and his clean boots, and his 2 witnesses from the previous encounter, now expanded to 4. "I don't know what you mean by that," Ethan said. "I think you do," Bennett said. He moved forward a few steps, casual, unhurried, the way a man moved when he was very sure of the room he was in. A poor man starts calling on a wealthy woman spending time at her family's property exchanging letters. I'd call that a man working on a plan. I'd call it 2 people who know each other, Ethan said. Is that what you'd call it? That's what I'd call it. Bennett looked at him with an expression that Ethan recognized as performance, not genuine hostility, but hostility arranged for an audience, which was different and somehow worse. You know what this county calls it, Walker? It calls it a poor man sniffing around a fortune he didn't earn and doesn't deserve. The store had gone very quiet. Ethan was aware of everyone in it. He was aware of old Cassidy from the telegraph office over by the newspaper rack. He was aware of 2 women near the bolts of fabric who had gone entirely still. He was aware of the store owner behind his counter, making the face of a man who very much wanted this to conclude without any property damage. He was also aware of exactly how much Bennett wanted him to react. Wanted him to push back loudly. Wanted him to say something that could be taken out of context. Wanted some physical confirmation of the story. Bennett had been building that at Ethan Walker was an aggressive man with predatory intentions toward a woman above his station. So he didn't give him any of that. A person who needs money to prove their worth. Ethan said with the same quiet he used for everything, never understood worth at all. He put his hat on and walked to the door. Good morning, Bennett. He heard the scrape of boots behind him. He kept walking. Running away doesn't change what you are, Bennett said. Ethan stopped with his hand on the door. He didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment, 2 seconds, 3 with his hand on the door, and the cold coming in through the cracks, and the entire store holding its breath. Then he pushed the door open and walked out. He rode home with the particular tight control of a man whose hands want to shake and who won't allow it. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and he didn't write anything, and he didn't send any letters, and he went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay on his back in the dark, thinking about exactly nothing until he fell asleep. He found out 3 days later through Hector what had happened after he'd left the store. What had happened was that Cassidy from the telegraph office had said in the full hearing of the remaining witnesses that in his opinion, a man who walked away from that kind of provocation showed more character than one who could afford not to. And the store owner had said that Walker's account was paid in full and always had been unlike some people he could name. And one of the women by the fabric bolts had told her husband that evening, and her husband had told 2 other men the next morning, and by the 3rd day, the story circulating in Garfield County had shifted subtly, not completely, but perceptibly, in a direction that was not entirely what Bennett had intended. Ethan sat with that information for a while. Then he went back to work. The letter from Cornelius Whitmore arrived on a Thursday. Not from Anna. From Cornelius Whitmore himself, in a hand that was heavy and deliberate, and gave the impression of a man who chose every word with the same consideration he applied to cattle purchases. It said, "Mr. Walker, I would ask you to come to my home on Saturday at 2 o'clock for a conversation that I believe is overdue. This is not a summons. You are free to decline. But I think it would be useful for both of us. C. Whitmore." Ethan read it twice. Then he set it on the table and made coffee and stood at the window for a while, thinking about the particular calculus of this situation, which was not simple. Whitmore could want several things. He could want to pay Ethan off, try again with a larger number, and see if a larger number worked where the first one hadn't. He could want to warn him off the way men like Whitmore sometimes warned men like Ethan with the particular authority that came from owning things that other people needed. He could want something else entirely. Ethan thought about Anna. About 3 words on a piece of paper. About biscuits on a table, and a laugh that caught her by surprise. He wrote back, "I'll be there at 2. E. Walker." Saturday came cold and clear. He rode out in his good coat, his only coat technically, but the better of the 2 he'd owned before the ranch went, and the one he'd kept for the occasions that warranted it. He got to the Whitmore estate at 5 minutes before 2 and tied his horse and went up the porch steps and knocked. May answered. She looked at him with that thorough assessing look she'd given him in November, and then she said, "He's in the study," and led him back through a hallway and knocked on a door and opened it. Whitmore was at his desk. He stood when Ethan came in, which was something, and gestured to the chair across from him, which was the same chair Ethan had sat in when Whitmore had pushed a glass of whiskey at him and asked what he wanted. Today there was no whiskey. There were 2 cups of coffee already poured. "Sit down," Whitmore said. Ethan sat. Whitmore sat across from him and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at Ethan with the measuring expression that was apparently his natural resting state. "I'm going to speak plainly," he said. "I appreciate that," Ethan said. "My daughter has been spending significant time at your property," Whitmore said. "She has been writing you letters. She has told me in a conversation that I would describe as among the more difficult of my life that she has no interest in Charles Bennett's proposal." He paused. "She also told me that this decision would stand regardless of what I said about it." Ethan said nothing. "I want to understand," Whitmore continued, "what your intentions are." "My intentions," Ethan said, "are to be what I am and to treat your daughter with the honesty and respect she deserves. Beyond that, anything further is between her and me." Whitmore looked at him. "That's a careful answer." "It's an accurate one." "Are you in love with my daughter, Mr. Walker?" The directness of it landed in the room and sat there. Ethan held the man's gaze. "I think," he said slowly, "that what I feel for your daughter is something I'm not going to name to someone else before I've said it to her. With respect." Something moved in Whitmore's face. Not softness exactly, but a recognition of something. "She could have anyone," Whitmore said, not cruelly, with the plain factual quality of a man stating a business truth. "Yes," Ethan said, "she probably could. Charles Bennett has land money connections. He could give her a life she's accustomed to." "Yes," Ethan said again. "What can you give her?" Ethan thought about this with the seriousness it demanded. He didn't hurry his answer. "Honesty," he said finally. "A man who sees her as herself, and not as a name or a fortune or an alliance. Work beside her rather than over her. The kind of respect that doesn't depend on what she's wearing or who her father is." He paused. "It's not much by some measurements." "By some measurements," Whitmore said quietly, "it's everything." The silence that followed that statement was a different kind of silence than anything that had come before in this room. Whitmore picked up his coffee and drank from it and set it back down, and he looked at some point past Ethan's shoulder with an expression that Ethan suspected was not meant to be witnessed. "Her mother," Whitmore said finally, "died when Anna was 11. I raised her alone after that. I gave her everything I could give her." He was quiet for a moment. "I may have given her the wrong things in the wrong proportion. I've wondered about that." Ethan said nothing because there was nothing to say to that would help. "Charles Bennett," Whitmore continued, "is a known quantity. He's predictable. I know what Anna's life would look like with him in it, and I know she would be safe and comfortable and—" He stopped. "And," Ethan said, Whitmore looked at him directly. "And she would shrink," he said. The word came out with a reluctance that told Ethan it had cost him something to locate it. "She is not a woman who should shrink. Her mother was not that kind of woman. He stopped again. "I have seen it happening already these past 2 years, and I have told myself it was maturity, and it is not." The room was very quiet. "What are you telling me, Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan said. Whitmore set down his coffee cup with the particular deliberateness of a man who has reached the end of a long internal debate and is now committed to the side he's landed on. "I am telling you," he said, "that I am not going to stand in my daughter's way. I am also telling you that if you hurt her, you will find out that an old man with significant resources is a more formidable adversary than Charles Bennett with his audience at a dry goods store." Ethan held his gaze. "Fair enough," he said, "and I'm telling you one more thing." Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "She is going to give up things for this. Real things. Comfort position, the life she was built for. You need to understand the weight of that and not take it lightly. Not today, and not 5 years from now when the newness has worn off and what you have is simply your life." "I understand that," Ethan said. "I've thought about it more than I've thought about almost anything." "Good." Whitmore sat back. "Then we understand each other." He extended his hand across the desk. Ethan shook it. He was riding home an hour later with his mind so full of the afternoon that he almost didn't hear the horse coming up behind him until it was close. He turned in the saddle. "Anna." She pulled up beside him on the road and looked at him with bright eyes and a face that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing. "How did it go?" she said. "You knew about the meeting," he said. "I suggested it," she said, which was not quite an admission, but close enough. "He needed to talk to you, and he wasn't going to ask, so I told him to ask." "You told Cornelius Whitmore what to do." "I suggested," she said again, with a precision that made him understand that this was a distinction that had been worked out carefully in her household over many years. "How did it go?" He looked at her for a moment. At the face he had been watching carefully for 3 months and knew better now than he'd known almost any face in his life. Every small movement of it, every specific expression in its vocabulary. "He told me not to hurt you," Ethan said, "or he'd make my life difficult." She blinked. Then something crossed her face that might have been affection, or exasperation, or both. "That sounds like him. He also said something else," Ethan said. He pulled his horse to a stop because what he was about to say required not moving. She stopped beside him. "He said that you are not a woman who should shrink," Ethan said. "I happen to agree with him." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know something, Anna. What I wrote in that letter that I can't unknow having seen a version of my life with another person in it, that's not a small thing for me to say. I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't mean things by halves." She was very still. "I know that," she said quietly. "Then I want you to know this." He held her gaze with the full steadiness that was just himself undecorated. "I'm not asking you to choose a smaller life. I'm asking you to choose a different one. And I know those feel the same from where you're standing right now, but I don't believe they are, and I'm asking you to trust that." Something broke open in her face. Not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices, or any of the mechanisms that stories used for these moments. Quietly. The way ice broke in spring, not a single crack, but a whole surface releasing at once, and underneath it, something that had been waiting a long time to move. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. I know," he said again more gently. She looked at him across the 3 feet of winter air between their horses. "I want to say it properly." He waited. "I love you," she said, with the same directness she'd brought to everything from the first morning she'd woken up in his cabin. No qualifications, no hedging, just the true thing stated plainly. "I have been trying to talk myself out of it for 2 months because I was afraid of what it would require, and I can't talk myself out of it, and I've stopped trying." He looked at her for a long moment. "I love you too," he said. "I've been less talkative about it internally, but the answer was the same." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. Of course it was. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, gloved both of them but still, and held it. She turned her hand and held his back. They sat like that for a moment on the winter road, with the sky doing what Montana skies did in February, enormous and cold and indifferent to the small human things happening beneath it. There are going to be people, he said, who have a great deal to say about this. Let them say it, she said, which was what he'd said to Hector 3 months ago, and the fact that she'd used his own words without knowing they were his felt like something. Bennett is not going to stop, he said. No, she agreed. He won't. And there will be others like him. People who decide what this is and what I am and what you're giving up. Yes, she said. I can't protect you from that. I'm not asking you to protect me from it, she said. I'm asking you to stand beside me while we face it. A pause. There's a difference. There is, he said. He tightened his hand on hers briefly. All right. They rode back to the cabin together side by side on the winter road, and the country stretched out around them, big and cold, and full of the specific kind of promise that places like Montana always held brutal and beautiful in equal measure, not offering anything easy, but offering for those willing to work for it, something that lasted. Inside the cabin, she put on coffee while he tended the fire, and they moved around the small space with the easy efficiency of people who had learned the geography of each other's habits, and he watched her reach for the coffee tin without looking for it, because she knew where it was, and something settled in him, with the quiet solidity of a thing that has found the place it belongs. He was pouring the coffee when the sound of hooves reached them. Fast hooves, too fast for a social call. He set the pot down. He was at the door before the knock came. It was the Whitmore livery boy, the same one who had delivered the first letter 4 months ago. Except today, the boy's face was different. Today, the boy looked like someone who had been riding hard and had not wanted to be the one to carry the news he was carrying. What is it? Ethan said. The boy looked past him to where Anna had come to stand behind his shoulder. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat and held it out. Anna took it. Ethan watched her read it. He watched her face go through 3 things in rapid succession: confusion, then comprehension, then a stillness that was harder to watch than either of the others. She lowered the paper. What is it? He said. My father, she said. Her voice was level in the way voices went level when a person was working very hard. He's had a meeting today, after hours. She looked up at Ethan. Charles Bennett came to the house with a lawyer. He's presenting my father with a contract, a business arrangement, a merger of the cattle operations. And the condition of the arrangement is... She stopped. The condition is that I marry Charles by spring. Ethan stood very still. And your father, he said. She looked at the paper again, at whatever was written there that he couldn't see from where he stood. He's asking me to come home, she said. Tonight. A pause. And he says to come alone. The boy was still on his horse in the yard. The fire was going in the cabin behind them. The coffee was poured and cooling on the table. Ethan looked at Anna. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for a long moment, and in that moment, everything that had been building for 4 months, every letter, every biscuit, every conversation at the work table, every deliberate, careful, measured step they had taken together, hung in the air between them like something that could still go either way. Go, he said. Ethan, go, car, he said again, gently, but without any give in it. This is your family. You need to hear what he has to say. He held her gaze. And I'll be here when you come back. She looked at him with an expression he didn't have a word for. You're sure, she said. I'm sure, he said. She folded the paper. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. She stopped in front of him for just a moment, close, both of them holding their breath in the small space between, and then she put her hand briefly against his face, just once, just barely, and then she walked out. He stood in the doorway and watched her ride out after the livery boy getting smaller against the winter country, and he kept his face still and his body very quiet. Then he went inside and drank the coffee that was still on the table, and he sat in his chair, and he waited, and he told himself that whatever was coming, he would face it, the same way he'd faced everything else in his life, standing up, looking directly at it, with his name still his own. He waited. Outside, the light went out of the sky, and the stars came up, and the temperature dropped, and Montana went about its indifferent business. And Ethan Walker sat in his cabin and held everything he was in both hands and would not let go. He didn't sleep. He tried around midnight because a man who didn't sleep was a man who couldn't think straight, and he needed to think straight. He lay on his back in the dark, and he listened to the wind work on the cabin, and he went over the same ground he'd been going over since she wrote out the contract. The lawyer Bennett, sitting in Whitmore's study with a document that put a price on Anna's future and called it a business arrangement. He thought about Whitmore's face across the desk that afternoon. The way the old man had said she would shrink. The way he'd said it like it cost him something to admit. He thought about a man who had watched his daughter becoming less of herself for 2 years and called it maturity. He thought about what Bennett's offer actually was beneath the legal language. It was a threat dressed up as an opportunity. It was a man saying, "Give me what I want, or I will damage what you've built." Ethan knew that move. He'd seen it used on his own father in a different form, with different paperwork, and he knew exactly how it ended. He got up at 4 in the morning and made coffee and sat at the table and waited for daylight. She arrived at 7:30. He heard the horse from inside, and he was at the door before she'd dismounted. One look at her face told him most of what he needed to know. She was composed the way she was composed when something had cost her that particular surface stillness she wore over difficult things. But underneath it there was something else, something hot and specific. She was angry. She came up the porch steps and he stood back to let her in, and she walked past him and turned around in the middle of the cabin and faced him. "He's going to sign it," she said. Ethan closed the door. "Tell me." Bennett came with a lawyer and a fully drawn contract. A merger, 4,000 head of cattle, the Eastern grazing rights, the Billings warehouse operation. Everything my father has spent 30 years building combined with Bennett's operation, which apparently has debt problems that nobody has been discussing publicly. She stopped. Bennett needs this arrangement as much as my father would benefit from it. Possibly more. And the condition? The condition is you, Ethan said. By April 1st, she said. 8 weeks. He stood very still. And your father said he was going to sign it. He said he needed to protect the operation. That without the merger, the Eastern grazing rights are in dispute. There's a legal challenge from another rancher that's been sitting in the territory courts for 2 years, and it could go badly. Bennett has a judge. Her jaw tightened. Of course he has a judge. Of course, Ethan said. My father looked at me across the desk and he said, Anna, I built all of this for you, and if I lose it, there is nothing to leave you. She stopped. When she started again, her voice had the careful quality of someone keeping it level by force. And I sat across from him, and I thought about how much I love him, and how wrong he is, and how he cannot see the difference between those two things. What did you say to him? I said I needed the night. She looked at Ethan directly. I didn't sleep. Neither did I. Something moved in her face. I know what he's trying to do, she said. He's trying to protect me in the only language he knows. Money and land and legal documents. He doesn't have another language. My mother died before she could teach him one. Ethan moved to the table and pulled out a chair. Sit down, he said. I don't want to sit down. Sit down anyway, he said, not harshly, and she sat because she was exhausted, and they both knew it. He poured coffee and set it in front of her and sat across from her and let her have a moment before he said anything. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. He'd noticed that the first day when she was barely conscious and shaking, they'd been the last thing to shake. I need to tell you something, he said. And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. She looked at him. I'm not going to ask you to choose me over your father, he said. I want to be clear about that. That is not a choice I'm putting in front of you. Your father is not the enemy in this room. I know who the enemy is, she said. Bennett, he said. Bennett, she confirmed with a flatness that contained considerable heat. Then we're agreed on the problem, he said. Now I want to think about it straight, not with feeling, with thinking. He looked at her across the table. The legal challenge on the Eastern grazing rights. Do you know anything specific about it? She blinked. Whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. The challenge is from a rancher named Aldridge. He claims the eastern boundary was miscertified in the original territorial survey. The case has been in the courts for 2 years because the surveying records are incomplete. And Bennett has a judge. That's what my father believes. Does your father have a lawyer? In Billings. But the case is in the territory court in Miles City. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was thinking. She watched him think, which she'd told him once was one of the only things that reliably calmed her down when she was agitated because it looked so completely unlike panic. Here's what I think, he said. Bennett came with this contract because he needed to, not because he was in a strong position. A man who is in a strong position doesn't need to manufacture urgency. 8 weeks a judge, a complete legal package ready to go. That's a man who has been planning this for a while and chose this moment specifically. My father's hesitation, she said. She sat up straighter. He's been going back and forth on the Bennett proposal for months. Bennett found out somehow that my father's resolve was weakening and moved before it hardened again. And the thing that might harden it, Ethan said. She looked at him. You. Me, he said. Bennett came when he did because of us. Because word got back to him that your father had met with me, had some version of whatever that conversation was. Whatever it was, she said. So Bennett moved fast and brought lawyers, and used the one lever he had, the legal threat and the business offer combined. He needed your father's desperation to close the door before your father had time to think of another option. She stared at him. What other option? I don't know yet, Ethan said. But a man who manufactures urgency is a man who's afraid of time, which means time is actually working against Bennett, not against us. He paused. Your father has not signed yet. He said he needed a week to review the contract. A week? Ethan said. Yes. He looked at her. Then we have a week. She leaned forward. To do what, Ethan? I can't solve a territory court case in a week. I can't make Bennett's judge disappear. I can't. No, he said. But you can find out if the judge Bennett has is the only judge who matters, and you can find out exactly how much debt Bennett's operation is carrying, because a man who needs this merger, as much as your father thinks he needs it, is a man with something to lose, and that something might be worth knowing about. She was very still. You think Bennett is bluffing? I think a bluff and the real thing look exactly alike until you test them, he said. And I think he's been very careful not to let anyone test them. She looked at him for a long, specific moment. Where did you learn to think like this? Watching my father lose everything to men who were very confident and not actually as strong as they looked, he said. He said it without bitterness. Just fact. I spent a long time afterward thinking about what I would have done differently. You think about things long enough, you eventually learn them. She put her cup down. Something had shifted in her face. The hot anger was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer scattered. It had found a direction. I know someone in Miles City, she said slowly. A woman named Dorothea Price. Her husband was a territory lawyer for 20 years before he died. She kept his books, his case records. She kept everything. She would know which judge Bennett has, and she would know whether that judge has ever been reversed on appeal. Can you get word to her today? I can ride to Miles City today. That's a 6-hour ride. I'm aware of the distance, she said with a precision that told him she was already calculating. He held her gaze. Anna, I need to say one more thing. Say it. If it turns out there's no angle here, if Bennett's position is actually as solid as he's presenting it, and your father's legal situation is as bad as he thinks, I need you to promise me something. She waited. I need you to promise me that you'll choose what's true, he said. Not what you want to be true, not what would make this easier. What's actually true. Because I am not going to let you ruin your relationship with your father for me. And I am not going to let you walk into a hard life with both eyes open and then discover the eyes weren't as open as you thought. The room was very quiet. You're telling me to consider the possibility that this doesn't work, she said. I'm telling you to be honest with yourself, he said. The way you always are. She looked at him for a long time. long enough that the fire shifted in the hearth and the light in the cabin changed incrementally. Then she said, "The possibility that it doesn't work has been in the room since November. I've considered it. I've done nothing but consider it. And every time I finish considering it, I arrive at the same place." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to stop arriving there, Ethan. Not because I'm not thinking straight. Because I am." He nodded once. "All right," he said. She stood up. She was already moving the way she moved when she'd decided something with the full forward energy of a person who was done with deliberation and had arrived at action. "I'll send a rider to Dorothea Price this morning," she said. "And I'm going to go through my father's legal papers. He keeps everything in the estate office. I know where everything is. I want to see the original surveying records on the eastern boundary myself before I let a lawyer tell me what they say." "What do you want me to do?" he said. She stopped. She looked at him with the specific look she used when something surprised her quick, and then immediately recalibrated. Like she hadn't expected him to ask what she needed, rather than deciding for her. "Find out about Bennett's debt," she said. "You know people in this county that I don't. People who wouldn't talk to me, but might talk to you." "I'll find out," he said. She moved to the door. He opened it for her. She was on the porch when she stopped and turned and looked at him with something in her face that was past careful and past managed and was simply what it was. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. She held his gaze for one more beat. Then she was on her horse and gone, and Ethan was already reaching for his coat. He rode to Hector's place first. Hector was at his barn, and he looked at Ethan coming in fast, and he put down what he was doing without being asked. He had the quality of a good man who recognized a serious face on someone he trusted. "Bennett's cattle operation," Ethan said. "What do you know?" Hector looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because I need to know fast, and I need to know accurate." Hector leaned against the barn post. "What I know is from last fall," he said carefully. "Reeves, you know Reeves over on the North Ridge. He sold Bennett 100 head in September. He told me Bennett paid half in cash and half in a note due in March." "A note due in March," Ethan said. "That's 3 weeks away." "That's what Reeves told me. And the way Reeves told it, he wasn't sure about the March payment. Said Bennett's man had come around once already with a story about a delay. How many notes like that would you guess Bennett has?" Hector scratched his jaw. "The way Bennett's been buying could be 3 or 4 creditors in the same position, maybe more." He looked at Ethan. "That's speculation." "Where would Bennett need to go to move a note like that, to roll over a debt that's coming due?" "First Trust in Billings," Hector said. "That's where everyone in the county goes for size." "Who handles the ranching accounts at First Trust?" Hector smiled. "A man named Theodore Park, and Theodore Park's brother-in-law is married to my wife's sister." He pushed off the barn post. "Give me until evening." Ethan was back at this cabin by mid-afternoon. He paced. He was not a man who paced. He was a man who worked so. He found things to do, split the remaining wood in the pile, repaired the broken hinge on the shed door that had been bothering him since December, checked the water trough. His hands were busy, and his mind was doing something underneath the work that felt like holding a complex piece of machinery together while it was still running. At 3 in the afternoon, a rider came from the Whitmore estate. It was May. He'd never seen May on horseback. She rode like a woman who had done it her whole life and stopped only because she didn't have to anymore, which meant she was using a skill she'd kept reserved. She pulled up in the yard and looked at him with an expression that was not quite alarm, but was moving in that direction. "Something's happened," Ethan said. "Mr. Bennett came back to the estate this morning," May said. "Early before 8 o'clock. Anna wasn't there. She'd already gone to the estate office to look through the papers, so it was Mr. Whitmore he saw." She pressed her lips together. "He was there for 2 hours. When he left, Mr. Whitmore called for me and told me to make a room ready." "A room," Ethan said. "For Miss Anna," May said. "Told me she'd be staying at the estate until the matter was settled. Said he was doing it for her protection." She looked at Ethan steadily. His words. The floor shifted under the conversation. "He's keeping her home," Ethan said. "May chose her words. He's managing the situation the way he manages things, with control over what's near him. Does Anna know? She knows now. She was in the office when I left. She'd found something in the surveying records. She wouldn't tell me what she just said to come here fast and tell you what I told you. May reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. She wrote it on the back of an envelope, said you'd know what to do with it. He took it, unfolded it. Anna's angular hand written fast the letters larger than usual. The Eastern Boundary Survey, 1871, was certified by a man named Harold Greer, territorial surveyor. Greer was removed from his position in 1873 for falsifying documents in 2 other cases. His certifications are legally challengeable on that basis. Aldridge's lawyer either doesn't know this or Bennett has kept him from knowing it. Dorothea Price's late husband challenged a Greer certification in 1874 and won. She will have the case records. Get them. And find out about the judge. His name is Harlan Foss. I think I know something about him, but I need to be sure. I'm being kept home. Don't come here. Trust me. A. He read it twice. Then he folded it and looked at May. The judge's name is Harlan Foss, he said. Do you know anything about him? May's face did something he couldn't read immediately, and then he could. Recognition. Harlan Foss, she said slowly, had a case 5 years ago that people in this county talked about for a long time. He ruled against a widow woman named Carver on a land dispute, took her land and gave it to a developer who had contributed money to the Territorial Campaign Fund. She paused. There was a petition. It went to the territory governor. Foss kept his seat, but he got a formal censure. It's public record. A censure. A judge with a censure on record ruling on a case where Bennett had a financial interest. That's appealable, Ethan said. That's grounds for an appeal filing before he ever rules. I wouldn't know about that, May said. But Anna seemed to think so. I was already thinking about where he needed to go and in what order. Miles City for Dorothea Price's case records. Hector's information about the debt. The censure documentation on Foss, which would be in the territory records in Miles City as well. All of it needed to be assembled and in front of a competent lawyer before Bennett got another meeting with Whitmore. He looked at May. How long before her father? How long before she has no freedom of movement? By tomorrow morning, May said with the blunt honesty of a woman who had worked in a house for many years and understood its operations clearly. He'll be more careful tomorrow. One day. Tell her, he started. She said to tell you nothing, May said. She said, and I'm quoting now, tell Ethan to do what he does, which is exactly what he said he would. She'll handle her end. He looked at May for a moment. She said that. Word for word, May said with the ghost of something around her mouth that was not quite a smile. He got on his horse. He rode to Hector's first, because Hector was closer, and Hector met him at the gate with the look of a man who had learned something interesting. Theodore Park, Hector said without preamble, has 3 notes on Bennett's cattle operation, totaling approximately $14,000. 2 are due in March. 1 was already extended from January. He let that land. Bennett is not in a comfortable position. He needs the Whitmore merger, Ethan said. Badly, Hector said. And fast. Then everything he's doing right now, the contract, the lawyer, the judge, all of it is a man who is out of time trying to look like a man who has all the time in the world. That would be my reading of it, Hector said. Ethan turned his horse toward the Miles City road. I'll be back by morning, he said. He rode 6 hours in the February cold. He rode with the specific focus of a man who has converted everything he's feeling into forward movement, which is both the most effective and most demanding form of management available. He did not think about Anna in a house being managed by a father who loved her and couldn't help what he was doing. He did not think about the 8-week clock, or the lawyer, or the censured judge. He thought about the road and the horse and the next thing that needed doing. He reached Miles City at 9:30. Dorothea Price lived in a narrow house on the east side of town, and she answered the door in her wrapper with a lamp in her hand and the expression of a woman who had spent many years answering doors at night for lawyers and had not lost the habit. He told her what he needed. She looked at him for a long moment. "Harold Greer," she said. "My husband spent 4 months on that case. Come in." The case records were thorough. They were organized in the way that careful people organized things, chronologically annotated with cross-references that a man who was not a lawyer could still follow if he paid attention. Ethan sat at Dorothea Price's kitchen table with a lamp and read for 2 hours while she made coffee and answered his questions and occasionally reached over and pointed to specific passages with a gnarled finger. At midnight, he had what he needed. He had the documented history of Harold Greer's fraudulent certifications. He had a copy of the 1874 case record showing a successful challenge to a Greer certification. He had the name of the Billings lawyer who had successfully argued that challenge, who was, as it happened, still practicing. And Dorothea Price, with the particular decisiveness of a woman who had her own reasons for disliking the judicial career of Harlan Foss, produced from a different file the original petition document from the Carver case with the territory governor's response attached, formal censure signed and dated. He thanked her. She told him to come back when this was finished and tell her how it came out. He rode back through the Montana night. He arrived at his cabin at 6 in the morning. He had 3 hours before anyone would be moving with the kind of purpose this day required. He made coffee and spread the documents on the table, and he organized them the way the documents needed to be organized, which was in the order of argument. What was true first, what it meant second, what it allowed third. At 9 o'clock. Hector arrived with a man Ethan had not expected. The man with Hector was tall, thin in his 50s, wearing a coat that was not expensive but was good quality, the coat of a man who valued function over appearance. He introduced himself as James Calloway, which was a name that rang a bell in Ethan's memory. "You argued the Greer certification challenge in 1874, Ethan said. "I did," Calloway said. He sat down at the table without being invited and looked at the documents spread there. And something in his face came alive with the particular interest of a man who has found a fight worth having. "Hector told me what you're dealing with. I haven't been able to stand Charles Bennett for a decade, so I am prepared to hear what you've got," Ethan told him. Calloway listened. He picked up documents. He read specific sections. He asked precise questions that told Ethan he was building something in his head as Ethan talked. When Ethan finished, Calloway set down the last document and looked at him. "If what you've told me about the debt is accurate," Calloway said, "and if I can file a recusal motion on Foss before Bennett gets a ruling, and if Whitmore gives me 48 hours to make contact with the Billings Circuit Court." He stopped. "It's not certain. Nothing is certain in a territorial court." "But," Ethan said. "But Bennett built this on the assumption that nobody would dig," Calloway said. "And somebody dug." He looked at Ethan with the measuring expression of a man recalibrating an assumption. "You're not a lawyer." "No," Ethan said. "You did in 12 hours what a lawyer would have taken a week to do." "I had good information from people who trusted me," Ethan said. "That's the whole of it." Calloway almost smiled. "All right," he said. "Let me tell you what I need." What he needed was a meeting with Cornelius Whitmore before Charles Bennett's next visit. Before the end of today. Ethan looked at him. "There's a problem with that," he said. "Anna is being kept at the estate. I was told not to go there." "You were told not to go there," Calloway said. "Yes." "Were you told anything about me going there?" Ethan thought about this for a moment. He thought about the note in Anna's angular hand. "Trust me." He thought about a woman who had learned from the ground up in the specific school of her father's household exactly how information moved and where the edges of control were. He thought about May, who had ridden out on a horse she didn't need to ride. "No," he said. "Nobody said anything about you." Calloway picked up his coat. "Then I'll need a letter of introduction," he said. "From someone Whitmore will receive." "I'll write one," Hector said from the doorway where he'd been standing quietly through all of it. "Whitmore knows my family. He'll receive Calloway if I ask him to." Ethan looked at his neighbor. "You don't have to put yourself in this," he said. Hector looked back at him with the steady calm that was simply who he was. "You've been my neighbor for 7 years," he said. "And in 7 years, you have never once asked me for a thing that wasn't reasonable. So." He picked up the pen from the table. Tell me what to write. He worked until his back ached and his hands were cold, and the light had changed enough to tell him it was mid-afternoon. Then he heard hooves. He straightened. 2 riders, coming fast from the Whitmore direction. He stood at the fence and watched them come. He recognized Anna's horse first, and then, riding beside her, not the livery boy, not May, not anyone from the estate staff. A man in a good coat, with the bearing of someone who had just finished a long meeting and had something to say about how it ended. Calloway. They pulled up at the fence line. Ethan looked at Anna's face. Her face told him everything before she said a word. Something in it had released not the hot anger of this morning, not the careful management of a woman holding herself together, but something older and quieter than both of those. The face of a person who has been in a hard fight and has come out the other side and is still standing. "He's not signing Bennett's contract," she said. Ethan let out a breath. "Calloway put the Greer documentation in front of my father," she said, "and the Foss censure record and the debt information. All of it." She held his gaze. "And my father sat with it for a long time. And then he looked at Bennett, who was there, who had come back this afternoon for the answer, and he said that he did not believe the terms as presented represented the full picture of the situation, and that he would need to revisit the arrangement with independent legal counsel." "What did Bennett say?" Ethan asked. "He said my father was making a serious mistake," she said. "And your father said—" Anna looked at him with something in her expression that was both old and new at once. "He said that he had made serious mistakes before, and that in his experience, they were far more recoverable than the kind you made by letting someone else make your decisions for you." Silence. Calloway, to his credit, was looking at the fence and not at either of them. "And the condition," Ethan said. "The part about you." "Gone," she said simply. "When the contract is off the table, the condition goes with it." She looked at him directly. "My father asked me after Bennett left whether I was certain about what I wanted. I told him I had been certain for some time." A pause. "He said he supposed he'd known that for a while too, and had been hoping he was wrong." "Is he angry?" Ethan asked. "No," she said, and in the way she said it, he heard something complex and final and true. "He's tired. He's been fighting the wrong war for a long time. He's tired." Her voice was quiet. "He wants to meet you again. Properly. Not as a problem he's managing. As himself. And you." Ethan looked at her across the fence line, 3 feet of winter grass and wire between them, the same kind of fence he'd been walking the night he found her. "All right," he said. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "He offered to help you," she said carefully. "Not money. Not a gift. He asked whether there was any interest in discussing the possibility of a lease extension on this land, a long-term arrangement through proper channels with fair terms." She held his gaze. "He said it was in his interest to have a good neighbor who he trusted to work the land well." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He understood exactly what Whitmore was doing. It wasn't charity. It was a man finding a way to help that didn't look like losing, and didn't ask Ethan to be smaller than he was. It was an offer made in the only language Cornelius Whitmore spoke naturally, the language of land and arrangements and things that lasted. "I'd be willing to discuss it," Ethan said. Something in Anna's face went soft around the edges. "Good," she said. She got off her horse. She walked to the fence, and she put both hands on the top rail, and she looked at him from 2 feet away, with everything she was right there in her face. No management, no careful surface. Just Anna Whitmore standing in a field in February, looking at the man who had pulled her out of the snow 4 months ago, and had not once in all the time since asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. "I told you I'd handle my end," she said. "You did," he said. "And you did what you said you'd do." "I had help," he said. "You always say that," she said. "It's always true," he said. She looked at him. "Ethan." "Anna." "We are standing at a fence in the cold," she said, "having a conversation that could happen inside where it is warm." He looked at the fence between them. Then he put his hand on the top rail and swung over it with the easy motion of a man who had been crossing fence lines his whole life, and he landed on her side. Her side. He looked at her. She looked at him. Calloway coughed politely and said he believed he'd head back to town, and neither of them acknowledged this, and he rode away with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who had done his job and was gracious enough to leave when it was finished. Ethan took Anna's face in his hands, the way he had in the snow the very first time. Except this time, she was warm and upright and looking straight at him, with eyes that were bright and clear and completely unguarded. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and then I'm going to stop talking." "All right," she said. "I have been careful," he said, "because you deserved careful. I have been slow because you deserved slow. I have let you decide your own pace because that was the only honest way to do this. And now I'm on your side of the fence, and I need to know." "Yes," she said. I hadn't finished. "Yes," she said again, with the precision of someone who has known the answer to a question for a long time and is done waiting for it to be asked properly. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he kissed her. Not gently, not tentatively. The way a man kissed a woman when he'd been careful for a long time and wasn't being careful anymore, with everything that had been held back, every deliberate restrained moment since November, all of it present and accounted for. She kissed him back exactly the same way. When they separated, she kept her forehead against his and closed her eyes for a moment, and he kept his hands on her face and breathed, and the February cold was completely irrelevant. "The town," he said, "is going to have a great deal to say." "I know," she said. "Bennett isn't finished," he said. "I know that too." "And your father." "Ethan," she said. I know all of it." She pulled back enough to look at him. "I have never in my life made a decision that I was more certain of. Not a single one." She held his gaze. "So let them talk." He looked at her for a long moment. "Let them talk," he said. Inside the cabin the fire had burned down to coals. He put more wood on it. She took off her coat and sat at the table, and he made coffee, and they sat across from each other in the small warm space of the life he'd built on 40 leased acres, and they talked until it was dark outside, and neither of them noticed when the dark came. Outside, Montana went on being enormous and cold and indifferent. Inside, something had been decided that would not be undecided, and Charles Bennett, riding back toward his own operation with 3 notes coming due, and no merger, and no judge, and no Anna Whitmore, was about to find out that the man he'd dismissed at the dry goods store had, while Bennett was arranging his audience, been busy doing the thing that men who actually understood worth always did. He'd worked. Quietly. Thoroughly. Without an audience. And the work had held. The town found out on a Tuesday. Not because Ethan told anyone. Not because Anna made any kind of announcement. But because small towns in 1879 Montana had their own intelligence network, built from dry goods counters and telegraph offices and Sunday church steps, and the news that Cornelius Whitmore had refused Charles Bennett's merger contract on the same day that his daughter had been seen riding back from Ethan Walker's property with a lawyer moved through Garfield County with the speed of something that had been waiting to move. By Wednesday morning, Ethan could feel it when he rode into town for supplies. Not hostility exactly. Something more complicated than that. People who had looked through him before now looked at him directly. Some with suspicion. Some with the particular curiosity of people recalibrating an opinion they'd held without examining it closely. Old Cassidy at the telegraph office tipped his hat. That was new. He did his business. He kept his face neutral. He rode home. What he didn't know, until Hector told him, Thursday evening, was what Charles Bennett had done after leaving the Whitmore estate empty-handed. Bennett had gone directly to the saloon on Main Street, and he had sat there for 2 hours, and he had talked, loudly, with the specific volume of a man converting humiliation into accusation. He'd told anyone who would listen that Ethan Walker had manipulated a grieving heiress and her aging father. That he'd manufactured legal problems that didn't exist to torpedo a legitimate business arrangement. That a poor man with 40 acres and a grudge had inserted himself into affairs that were none of his business and called it honesty. How many people believed him? Ethan asked. Hector thought about it. Some, he said honestly. The ones who were going to believe him regardless. But some of the others. He paused. Cassidy was in the saloon. He stood up and said that in his professional experience, which was 30 years of reading telegrams for this county, the men who yelled loudest about being wronged were generally the ones who'd been stopped from doing the wronging. He looked at Ethan. Bennett told him to sit down. Cassidy didn't sit down. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the telegraph operator who tipped his hat. "And Bennett," he said. "Left the saloon about an hour later," Hector said. "Hasn't been seen in town since." Something settled in Ethan's chest. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the specific quiet that came when a thing that had been loud and pressurized finally released. "His notes are due in 3 weeks," Ethan said. "Yes," Hector said. "Without the Whitmore merger, he can't roll them." "That is the mathematics of it," Hector agreed. Ethan picked up his coffee cup. "He's going to have a hard spring," he said. "He made his choices," Hector said simply. They sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable silence of two men who had known each other long enough that quiet was not uncomfortable. "You going to be all right?" Hector said finally. Ethan looked at him. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because being right and being easy aren't the same thing," Hector said. "And what's coming next isn't going to be easy. People are going to keep having opinions. Some of them are going to say them where you can hear." "People have been having opinions about me my whole life," Ethan said. "It hasn't stopped me yet." Hector nodded slowly. "No," he said. "It hasn't." He stood up. "Then I reckon you're going to be all right." He left, and Ethan sat alone in his cabin and let himself feel for the first time since February, since the contract, and the writer, and the long night of waiting, the full weight of what had happened. Not the legal parts, not the strategic parts, the simple human part of it. He had been afraid. He hadn't said so to anyone, including himself, but he had been afraid in the specific way a man was afraid when something mattered more than he'd intended to let it matter, and he could not fully protect it, and it had held. He put his hand flat on the table, the rough table he'd built himself 3 years ago, and he felt the grain of the wood under his palm, and he thought about what it meant to have something that held. Then he got up and went to bed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he slept straight through until morning. The Sunday gathering was Anna's idea. She brought it to him the following week when she rode out on a Wednesday morning and they were sitting at the table over coffee, and she said it the way she said things she'd been thinking about for a while, directly without preamble, as if the decision was already made, and she was simply informing the relevant parties. "I want to go to the Sunday gathering," she said. "With you, together, not separately and not by accident." He looked at her. "You want to walk in together." "I want to stop managing how people find out," she said. "I'm tired of the information arriving in pieces through back channels. I want to be standing in front of the community that has been talking about us, and I want them to see that we are not ashamed, and we are not hiding, and we are not asking permission." He considered this. "Bennett will probably be there." "I expect he will." "It's going to generate a reaction." "Yes," she said. "That's rather the point." He looked at her for a moment. She had the particular set to her chin that told him she had thought this through carefully and was not going to be talked out of it, which he'd stopped trying to do to her weeks ago, because it was both futile and, when he was honest, not something he actually wanted to do. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and something in her face relaxed a fraction, and he understood that despite the certainty in her voice, she had not been completely sure he'd agree, and the fact that she hadn't been sure but had asked anyway was its own kind of courage. Sunday arrived cold and bright, the kind of February day that Montana occasionally produced as a reminder that spring existed somewhere in the future and would eventually arrive. They rode in together on the main road side by side, which was how they'd been riding since February, and which no longer felt like anything other than the natural order of things. The gathering was on the church steps, and in the yard around it, the weekly social assembly that happened after services and before people dispersed back to their separate properties. There were perhaps 60 people. Ethan knew most of them by face, many by name. He felt them notice when he and Anna rode up. He felt it the way you felt. Whether in the shift of the air, in the specific quality of the silence that replaced whatever had been happening before they arrived. He got off his horse. He tied the reins. He went around and offered Anna a hand down, which she took, and they walked together toward the gathering. The first 10 seconds were the hardest. Then Dorothea Price, who had apparently made the 6-hour trip from Miles City, for reasons that Ethan suspected had nothing to do with the sermon, walked directly to them from across the yard and took Anna's hand and said, "I hear you've been making good use of my husband's files," in a voice loud enough for half the gathering to hear. Anna said, "Every page of them," and Dorothea Price smiled with the satisfaction of a woman for whom that was exactly the right answer. The second person was Cassidy from the telegraph office, who shook Ethan's hand with both of his and said only, "Good," which in its brevity contained more than most speeches. The third person was May, who should not have been there since she worked at the Whitmore estate on Sundays, but apparently had rearranged her circumstances for the occasion, and who stood beside Anna with the settled permanence of a woman who had decided which side of something she was on and would not be moved. The rest of the gathering broke into the pieces. That gatherings always broke into the people who came forward. The people who waited to see which way things went. The people who would never come forward and would talk on the way home. Ethan shook hands. He was not effusive about it. He was himself, which was what he'd been through all of it, and the people who were watching for something other than that didn't find it. Bennett was there. He was at the far edge of the yard near the road, with two of the men who had been his witnesses at the dry goods store. Ethan saw him and didn't look away. Bennett saw Ethan and didn't look away either. They held that for a moment across the width of the churchyard. Two men who understood each other's positions completely, with nothing left to obscure or manage or perform. Then Bennett turned and walked to his horse and rode away. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a scene. He simply left, and the two men who'd been with him looked at each other and then followed, and the portion of the gathering that had been watching Bennett for a cue visibly recalibrated. Ethan watched him go. He felt Anna beside him, not touching, not doing anything overt, just present in the specific way she was present when she was paying attention, and he felt her exhale slowly through her nose. "It's not over," he said quietly. "No," she agreed, equally quiet. "But he knows the room now." He looked at her. She was watching Bennett ride away with the calm of someone who has been in a long contest and has just watched the other party decide the odds no longer favor them. "You've been thinking about this longer than today," he said. "Since the contract," she said. "You work with what's in front of you." She turned and looked at him. "That's something you taught me." He held her gaze. "I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know." "You taught me to trust it," she said. The gathering continued around them, and they stayed. And when it was over, and people were moving back to their horses and their wagons, something had shifted in the accumulated understanding of Garfield County that would not entirely shift back. Not because anything dramatic had happened, because nothing dramatic had happened, because two people had stood in a churchyard and been exactly what they were without apology, and the community had looked at that and made what it would of it, and what most of it made on balance was something closer to respect than anything else. 3 weeks later, Charles Bennett defaulted on 2 of his 3 notes. The news came through Hector, who had it from Theodore Park's brother-in-law's wife, which was the same channel that had given them the debt information in February. The First Trust in Billings had sent a representative to assess Bennett's cattle operation. The representative had returned with a report that the operation was worth considerably less than the outstanding debt. "He's selling," Hector said. "Not everything, but the eastern section 300 head. Ethan said nothing. "The merger would have saved him," Hector said. "Your father-in-law, almost your father-in-law, would have absorbed the debt as part of the arrangement, and Bennett would have come out of it clean." "He wasn't going to get that for nothing," Ethan said. "No," Hector agreed. The price was Anna. They were quiet for a moment. "You feel anything about it?" Hector said. He was not asking maliciously. He was asking the way he asked everything directly because he wanted to know. Ethan thought about it honestly. He thought about Bennett in the dry goods store, Bennett in the saloon, Bennett at the churchyard turning and walking to his horse. "I feel sorry for him," he said finally. "Not much, but some." Hector looked at him. "That's bigger of you than it needs to be." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but hating a man takes energy I'd rather use for something else." He used the energy for something else. Spring arrived, the way. Spring arrived in Montana, not with ceremony, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small degrees. The ice in the creek pulled back from the edges. The grass showed first in the south-facing slopes where the sun hit longest. The cattle moved differently with the particular alertness of animals that could smell a change coming and were readying themselves for it. Ethan worked the land the way he always worked it, methodically, without waste, with the patience of a man who understood that the land didn't respond to urgency, but it did respond to consistency. And Anna worked beside him, not symbolically, not occasionally. She showed up in the mornings the way she showed up for everything she decided to do, completely with the full force of her attention, and she learned ranch work the way she'd learned everything, by doing it wrong. First asking exactly the right question about why it was wrong, and then doing it right with a precision that sometimes made him stop what he was doing and watch her. She was better with the cattle than he was. He told her so plainly one afternoon in March, when she'd handled a situation with the younger heifer, the one that still didn't have a name that would have taken him twice as long and probably more injury to his hands. "My father used to take me out to the operation when I was small," she said, before he decided it wasn't appropriate. She looked at the heifer, who was now calm and eating. "I was 12 when he stopped taking me. I've been waiting 20 years to do it again." He looked at her. "He stopped because you were too good at it, and it made him think about the wrong things." She turned and looked at him. "The wrong things." "About what he was building it for," he said. "And who?" She was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face, not grief exactly, but the particular tenderness of a person recognizing something that has been true for a long time without being said. "He's coming to dinner Sunday," she said. "I know," Ethan said. He'd been made aware of this arrangement 3 days ago through Anna in the matter-of-fact tone she used when she'd already decided something that she knew he wasn't going to push back on. "He's nervous," she said. "So am I," Ethan said. She looked at him with surprise. It was genuine, the quick, unguarded blink of someone who hadn't expected it. "You're never nervous." "I'm always nervous," he said. "I just keep it somewhere useful." He looked at her. "Your father built something from nothing over 30 years. He's going to sit in my cabin and eat at my table and look at what I have to offer his daughter, and whatever he says, I'm going to feel him doing that arithmetic. The arithmetic comes out in your favor," she said. "You're biased." Shamelessly, she said, without a trace of apology. He almost smiled. He was doing that more regularly now. She'd noticed and had said nothing about it, which was the correct response and which he appreciated. Cornelius Whitmore arrived Sunday at noon. He came alone, no staff, no escort. Just the old man on his big horse, which was a choice that Ethan recognized as deliberate. He tied the horse himself. He came up the porch steps and knocked, which was another choice, because a man like Whitmore didn't usually knock. Ethan opened the door. They looked at each other. "Mr. Walker," Whitmore said. "Mr. Whitmore," Ethan said. "Come in." May had helped Anna prepare the meal she'd come out 2 days earlier at Anna's request, and they'd cooked together for the better part of an afternoon. There was beef, good beef and cornbread, and a dried apple pie that sat on the counter and filled the cabin with a smell that Ethan had not experienced in this cabin before, and which changed something about it in a way he couldn't name precisely. Whitmore sat at the table, and he looked around the cabin, the way Anna had looked around it in November, reading it, cataloging it. Ethan let him look. "It's small," Whitmore said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Anna grew up in a house with 14 rooms." "I know that," Ethan said. Whitmore looked at him. And she's the one who decided," Ethan said. "Not me. I was careful about that." Whitmore picked up his coffee cup. He turned it in his hands without drinking from it. He was a man doing the work of reassembling something. Some picture of the world that had been drawn one way and was being redrawn, and the redrawing was not comfortable but was happening anyway, because he was at his core an honest man. "She told me about the letters," Whitmore said. Ethan waited. "She said you wrote her back the same day every time." He paused. "She said you were the first person in her life who argued with her." "I didn't argue with her," Ethan said. "I told her the truth when I thought she needed it." "Same thing," Whitmore said. In her experience, same thing. He finally drank from the cup. Her mother used to do that. I never could. I was always trying to protect her from hard things, and her mother would look at me and say, "Cornelius, you cannot love someone enough to make the world soft." He set the cup down. I've thought about that sentence for 15 years. The cabin was quiet. Anna came in from outside, where she'd been doing something with practiced deliberateness that gave them time, and she looked at both of them and read the room in the way she read everything quickly, completely, and she sat down and served the meal without saying anything unnecessary. They ate together. It was not comfortable. It was not easy. But it was real, which was something Ethan had learned to value above both comfort and ease, and about an hour into it, something shifted at the table, some angle of tension released, and Whitmore asked Ethan about the eastern pasture, and Ethan answered, and Whitmore followed up, and Anna sat between them and watched it happen with an expression that she was not quite managing. After the meal, Whitmore pushed back from the table and looked at Ethan directly. "I want to tell you something," he said. Ethan waited. "The lease arrangement that we discussed," Whitmore said. "I've had Callaway draw up the terms. Long-term 15 years renewable. Fair market rate not below because I don't want you thinking it's charity." He looked at Ethan with the steady gaze of a man who needed to be understood precisely. "It is not charity. It is a business decision based on my assessment of you as a neighbor and a steward of the land." "I understand that," Ethan said. "And separately from that," Whitmore continued, "I want to say one more thing. To you." He paused. He was finding words Ethan could see. It could see the work of it in a man who was not naturally given to this kind of statement. "What you did in February, the legal work, Callaway, all of it, you did it for her, not for yourself. You could have let Bennett win and walked away clean and told yourself it wasn't your problem." "No," Ethan said. "I couldn't have." "No," Whitmore said. "I don't think you could have." He looked at his hands briefly. "I misjudged you early. I was looking for a motive I recognized, and I couldn't find one, and I decided the one I couldn't find was the suspicious one." He looked up. "I was wrong." Ethan held his gaze. "I appreciate you saying it." "I mean it," Whitmore said. "That's the only reason I said it." Anna put her hand over her father's on the table. Just for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and drank from it, and looked at the middle distance with the careful composure of a woman who was not going to cry at her own dinner table, and was exercising considerable discipline in service of that goal. Whitmore stayed another hour. He and Ethan talked about cattle and land and the coming spring, and slowly, the way things happened between two men who didn't have a natural language for each other, but were both trying. Something was built that wasn't friendship yet, but was the material that friendship came from. When he left, he shook Ethan's hand on the porch. Longer than the last time. With both hands briefly the way he'd shaken Callaway's hand in his own study, the grip of a man who was committing to something. "Sunday dinners," Whitmore said. "If that's agreeable." Ethan looked at him. "That's agreeable." He nodded. He got on his horse. He was almost to the gate when he stopped and turned in the saddle and looked back at the cabin where Anna had come out onto the porch and was watching him go. "Anna," he said. "Papa," she said. "Your mother would have liked him," he said. Simply, factually, the way he stated things that were true. He didn't wait for a response. He turned back to the road and rode, and Anna stood on the porch and watched him go until the sound of hooves faded into the distance. Ethan came and stood beside her. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Her jaw was set in the specific way it was set when she was holding something that wanted to move. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, "He's never said anything like that to me. About her. About what she would have thought." "He meant it," Ethan said. "I know he meant it," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's what it is." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, not dramatically, just the weight of a person allowing themselves to be held, and they stood on the porch of his small cabin on his leased 40 acres, and they looked at the spring afternoon, which was carrying the first real warmth of the year, and smelled like turned earth and something just beginning. The wedding happened in May, not a large one. Anna had said from the beginning that she did not want large, not because she was ashamed of anything, but because the things that mattered to her had never required an audience. They married in the church in town with Hector and his wife, May Calloway, Dorothea Price, who made the trip from Miles City again, and Cornelius Whitmore, who stood at the front of the church in his best coat and gave his daughter's hand, with the expression of a man doing the hardest and most correct thing simultaneously. The pastor said the words. Ethan said his. Anna said hers, without looking at anything except him, which was how she did everything that mattered. When it was done, Cassidy from the telegraph office started clapping, which was not customary, and then most of the rest of the church joined in, and Ethan stood with his wife's hand in his and let it happen. Outside on the church steps afterward, Bennett's 2 former witnesses came and shook Ethan's hand separately, not together, each in their own time, with the brief, sincere quality of men squaring something with themselves. He shook both hands. He thanked both men. He meant it. May cried. She denied this. There was evidence. Hector clapped Ethan on the shoulder so hard it moved him a step sideways, which was Hector's version of a speech. Whitmore embraced his daughter, really embraced her. Not the formal contact of a man who'd learned physical affection too late, but the full embrace of a father who had decided to stop protecting and start being present. And Ethan watched it from 3 feet away and felt something quiet and significant in his chest that he didn't try to name. That summer they built the second room. Ethan had designed it over the winter on paper in the evenings after Anna went to sleep with the careful precision of a man who'd built things before and understood that a structure was only as good as what it was built on. He drew it 3 times before he was satisfied. When he showed Anna, she looked at it for a long time. The window faces east, she said. Morning light, he said. She looked at him. For a nursery, she said. Eventually, he said. If that's something you want. Is it something you want? She said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, simply. Then yes, she said, equally simple. They broke ground in June. Hector came and helped with the framing. 2 other neighbors came, men who had watched the churchyard encounter in February and drawn their own conclusions about the kind of man Ethan Walker was, and worked 2 days without being asked for payment, which Ethan accepted without argument, because refusing help from a neighbor was its own kind of pride, and he'd learned to distinguish between the useful kind and the damaging kind. Whitmore came one afternoon and stood and watched and didn't offer to help because he understood by now that the work was Ethan's to do. But he brought a bottle of whiskey that was very good, and he left it on the porch without comment. By July, the room was framed. By August, it had walls and a roof, and the east-facing window that Anna sat in front of on a morning in late August and read with the light coming in flat and golden. And Ethan came in from outside and stood in the doorway and looked at her there in his house, in the room he'd built, in the light that came in from exactly where he'd meant it to come from, and felt something that he had no language for and didn't need one. She looked up. What, she said. Nothing, he said. Just looking. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her book, but one corner of her mouth moved in the way it moved when she was pleased about something she wasn't going to make a production of, and he went back to work. That was how they lived. Not without difficulty. Not without the days when the money was short, and the work was hard, and the weather was uncooperative, and the distance between where they were and where they'd each come from made itself known in ways that required honesty and patience, and the willingness to sit with discomfort until it passed. Those days came. They dealt with them the same way they dealt with everything else, directly together, without performing for each other. Anna learned things she hadn't known. Ethan learned things he hadn't known. Those were different lessons, and sometimes the learning was uncomfortable, and they said so when it was and kept going. The county kept talking. People always talked. But the talk changed over time the way opinions changed when they had to reckon with sustained evidence. What the community watched month after month and year after year was a woman who had walked away from a 14-room house and a cattle empire, and who was demonstrably plainly in the specific, observable way of a person whose daily life confirmed it. Content. Not resigned. Not making the best of things. Content. And beside her a man who had been dismissed as a failure and a grasper, and a man without worth who turned out to be. And this was the thing the county had to sit with and eventually had to accept simply a man. Quiet, consistent, honest, present. A man who meant what he said and said what he meant, and had worked without an audience and without applause and without any mechanism except his own sense of what was right. In November, 1 year after the blizzard, Ethan was checking the south fence line when he stopped at the property marker stone. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the stone. He thought about a woman going to her knees in the snow beside it, with blue lips and hands going white, and a choice he'd made in about half a second. Anna came up behind him on her horse. She'd been checking the north fence, and their routes had converged the way their routes had a tendency to converge now, as if the land itself had learned their patterns. She pulled up beside him and looked in at the stone. 1 year, she said. 1 year, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd stayed inside? No, he said. She looked at him. I know myself well enough to know I couldn't have, he said, so thinking about it is pointless. She looked at the stone. I've thought about it, she said. I think about it sometimes. Waking up in the morning in a house with 14 rooms and never knowing. She paused. Never knowing what I was actually capable of, what I actually wanted, who I actually was without the frame around me. He turned and looked at her. You would have found out some other way, he said, eventually. Maybe, she said. But not yet. And not like this. He held her gaze. She held his. The wind was cold. The sky was doing what Montana skies did in November, going enormous and gray and serious. The land stretched in every direction, with the particular relentlessness that either broke a person or settled something in them. He felt settled. He had felt settled since May, since the morning he'd woken up with a wife in the house he'd built, and the east-facing window throwing light across the floor, and the particular quiet of a life that was exactly the size it needed to be. Come on, he said. It's cold. She turned her horse toward home. He turned his. They rode back across his land. Their land under the terms of the 15-year lease that had been signed in March and which Calloway had framed and which hung on the wall of the cabin next to the window that faced east. And they rode the way they always rode, now side by side with the easy parallel rhythm of two people who had found their pace and kept it. The cabin had smoke coming from the chimney because Anna had started the fire before she came out, which was something she'd started doing in September and which he'd said nothing about, but which he noticed every time. He noticed most things. That was something she had said to him once, that he was the most observant person she had ever met, and the least likely to announce it, and he had said that announcing it was the part he'd never seen the use of. She'd said, I know, that's what I mean. He hadn't entirely understood that at the time. He thought he understood it now. They rode into the yard and unsaddled the horses and turned them out, working together with the efficiency of people who had done something together enough times that it no longer required coordination. It was simply one motion with 4 hands. Inside, the fire had caught, and the cabin was warm, and there was coffee in the pot from the morning, which Anna reheated while Ethan hung up his coat, and they sat at the table and drank it in the particular silence that was not absence of sound, but presence of everything that didn't need saying. Outside, Montana continued big and cold and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when they didn't need to try. Inside, 2 people sat at a table that a man had built with his own hands and drank coffee that wasn't fancy, and said nothing, because everything that needed to be said had been said in letters and at fence lines and in courtrooms and on church steps, and what remained was simply the life itself. That was enough. It was in the end